Well, it's now 1:02, so we can get this show on the road, as they say, and go ahead and start the latest installment of the Non-Degree Credentials Research Network's monthly webinar series. Today's presentation is on a report that'll be coming out next month. So we'll be getting a preview here today, a roadmap for the alignment of digital credentials, hiring processes, and technology systems. I thought this was a really interesting topic that speaks directly to obviously the research that many of us are doing, but even those of us who have more of a higher education focus to better understand. And we often think of employers and higher education institutions as being, very distinct actors, but there's actually a lot of interplay between what they are all trying to do to prepare students to enter the world and have a successful career. So, this is really, I think, an interesting opportunity to learn more about the different types of data that exist on the employer side and how we might be able to build bridges between higher ed and employer data systems. So without further ado, we have Anne Nonovic from the Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy at Northeastern University, joined by Chris Houston from One Ed Tech and Ellen Stoddard from Fairlead Education. They've been working together on this project among other co-authors. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to our presenters. We'll go for about, I think, usually it's about 20 minutes, half an hour of presentation. And then we'll moderate a little Q&A. So without further ado, go ahead, Ellen, Chris, or Anne.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle. Hopefully we have time to go slightly over the 20 to 30 minute mark.
We can do 40.
Okay, I'll take it.
That was just like, yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Guess I'll give a few minutes at the important thing is that we just have a little bit of time at the end.
Perfect. Yeah, and just thank you so much for the opportunity to present this very recent research that we've done on the consumer side of non-degree credentials, really looking at what happens after they're issued. As mentioned, this is a report that will be coming out shortly. We're looking at very beginning of September. So again, just grateful to be able to talk about it. So Chris, if you want to go ahead and advance. The agenda for today, we'll be covering our background on the project, our project aims. This is an exploration of how non-degree credentials are being used in hiring and what can be done to address any roadblocks in doing so. Ellen is going to explain the process of this research. Part of that process was really talking with employers and HR leaders, and we developed some HR leader personas, sort of grouping it around what it is they were asking for out of non-degree credential data and process flows. When we found a theme, a pain point in this process for them, our team investigated the technical underpinnings of that. So if there was an issue in, say, data flow of credential data going to the employers, we really looked under the hood and understood how that flow is happening and where there might be breakdowns. As a result of that research, we then generated a roadmap. So this is using a little bit of imagination to match the needs that these employers were expressing with HR tech and ed tech capabilities. So we'll present that today. And finally, as Kyle mentioned, we would love to have some Q&A. Please feel free to populate questions in the chat and we will try to get back to address all of those. Great. So project background and general aims. This is a collaborative project between One Ed Tech, Northeastern University's Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy, and the SHRM Foundation. It is funded by the Walmart Foundation, and it builds pretty much directly upon past research that this group has done. I believe Ellen presented on that research in this forum maybe a year or so ago. For this particular project, we're looking at understanding how HR leaders envision improvements to their hiring process. So understanding from them, like what their needs are in order to facilitate a better inclusion of information about non-degree credentials. So getting them to express their needs so that this can work. And then, as I mentioned before, based on that, generating some suggestions or a roadmap to improve this functionality. I think I'm going to go ahead then and kick it over to Ellen to talk about our process.
All right, thanks, Anne. Nice to be with everyone today. So in order to explain a little bit more about our methodology, we want to bring you into what was our process for uncovering some of the information that we'll share today. And we basically see it in these 3 stages. So in order to really understand employer needs and to be able to imagine improvements to the hiring process, specifically those that would help facilitate better inclusion of information about non-degree credentials, we started by conducting a series of 3 workshops. We had 15 HR professionals and hiring managers who were recruited by SHRM to participate. And we formulated questions about really how they consider and use non-degree credentials, specifically the prevalence of those credentials and the usage and the value they provide to hiring managers as they're going through that process. We also asked them about their pain points, their ideas for process improvement in their hiring. And then we took all of that information and we created prototypes. We wanted to solicit more feedback based on some immediate prototypes that they could respond to. So the prototypes were really in sort of a dashboard format where we said, would you like to consume data this way? Would you like to consume data this way? What are the certain things that you might want? Erica, I think you're on up there. Thank you, Erica. So after those prototypes, we went back to our team and we asked them to give us additional feedback. And then we were able to create 4 sort of composite personas, which we'll share in a minute. And each one of these personas, based on the 15 participants, we consolidated things together. Each one of those captures really a particular challenge and a possible solution to that challenge. So then in order to understand really the existing ecosystem and the data flow of information during the hiring process, Chris, who you'll hear from later, applied to 22 jobs, actually applied to the jobs, examined the data flow, and then went through and understood some of the major resume parsing solutions to figure out how that came into play in this data flow. And then finally, in order to envision a different future or some possibilities, we have created a roadmap which envisions the potential for change in this ecosystem and how data could flow in a way that improves the hiring process. So that's really our methodology. And then Chris, you can advance. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce the personas and how we imagine these. We analyzed the feedback that came in during the workshops, as I said. We generated these personas, and really they represent how people are using non-degree credentials. And we found that people basically fall into kind of these 4 perspectives here. So on the top left, we have Nick. Nick is we'll go back one more. Sorry, yeah, thanks. Nick is really eager to rely on non-degree credentials. And wants to have those credentials help him understand the whole person, so the candidate as a whole. Francis, willing to consider non-degree credentials, but is really much more focused on the skill aspect, so really understanding the skills that are represented in those credentials. And then we have Brianna. Brianna represents people who are really actively using these non-degree credentials, but they are feeling the pain of verifying them. So that's a roadblock for the Brianna type. And then Malik represents folks who want to use the non-degree credentials, but they're having trouble fitting them into their existing processes. And so this perspective helps us understand some desires and goals, and also some pain points. So I'm going to toss it to Chris to dive down more deeply into the pain points and some of our investigation around those.
Great, thank you, Ellen. And thanks again for this opportunity to share this information with you all. We do really hope it's helpful. And so just to dive a little bit deeper into the personas, you know, developing these personas, it gave us insight into the different pain points and just other information that also could be helpful during the hiring and recruiting process. And wanted to really dive deeper into the non-degree credential space as well. And so one thing, instead of just, we obviously listened to them, we wanted to do a little bit more research, investigation, just sort of back those up. Yes. Okay. All right. So we, just to kind of circle back on the 4 different personas we had here, they're in the same order listed. So the first one is Nick, focused on the whole person. He wants to trust the information. So that led us to do, an investigation into how the data gets into the system and then sort of what happens once it's there. And then I'll circle back here and I'll talk a little bit about resume parsing. It's maybe a little bit of a hidden part of the process, within hiring today. And so I'll go on to here. So as I can't remember if it was Anne or Ellen said, I applied to 22 different jobs, so 22 unique employers. We're trying to, again, try to follow what's happening with the non-degree credentials. And this is just one sort of example of our research. It's definitely not everything. We're gonna have quite a bit more. We'll have all of it in our paper, which will be out very soon here. It was more of an exercise too, to just sort of understand, identify, like basically what have I observed through this process? What are the patterns and key findings that we could take away from this? And so maybe I'll start with the numbers. So like I said, there were 22 different employers, 22 different positions. I did not actually get any of the positions, in case anyone's wondering. Got a lot of letters of rejection. At any rate, it was what really kind of struck me was some applications went really fast. Some took a long time, between 2 minutes and 35 minutes spending on filling out an application. It went from, hey, all I have to do is provide my LinkedIn, URL, and that was enough, to just minimal info, all the way to, wanting so much information that, I'm taking a full, half hour to just fill out information. I'm not sure if those are on purpose. I mean, there could be strategy around that. I know today one issue is that there's kind of swimming in applicants, not necessarily those who are all qualified. So there's a bit of noise there too. Anyways, keeping an eye on how skills are sort of being worked into this space. 3 of them did explicitly involve skills. A couple of them actually did some skill extraction, which we'll get to in a bit as well. Big variety of ATSs that were used. ATS is applicant tracking system, so that's the system used for managing recruiting and hiring. 14 required an account, which just sort of slowed me down. I understand why they do that. It's so you don't have to fill it all out in one sitting. You can maybe save it and come back, fill in some more before you actually, send it out. Some of them will give it actually a little dashboard sort of a thing that says, hey, we've received your resume or your application, and someone will be contacting you, that kind of stuff. I'd say, yeah, more than half, it looks like, do use resume parsing software, where what that is it takes your unstructured data, whether it's a Word document or PDF, that is your resume. It's unstructured data, which means it's not really machine readable. It's not great for dumping into a database. So what that process is it converts all of the unstructured data into structured data. 4 to 6 of them actually did give you the ability to import data from LinkedIn, and 3 had an autofill sort of feature where it would, you'd first maybe upload your resume, it would parse it and try to autofill as much of the application as possible. One of the issues there though is, it only did so well at being able to guess at some of that data, unfortunately. So one kind of our first question was, how do we, or are non-degree credentials getting lost, or are they still kind of making it through? We found there's really sort of 4 or 5 ways of getting that information to the recruiter and onto the hiring manager. You can put it on your resume, you can put it on your LinkedIn page. And if they import that data from LinkedIn, that's great. Otherwise, it can, just go out to your LinkedIn profile. Yep, there's the ability to, like I just said, upload a resume and it parses it and then it kind of autofills it for you. You can manually enter some. I'll circle back to that in a moment as well. And then, or you could just attach, say if you have a certificate, you could attach that along with your application. One of the key things I was also looking at is there are newer digital credentials, digital badges, verifiable credentials. None of those had any sort of integration, or there was really no way to include that type of digital information into the hiring process. I can't really put it on my resume. I don't know how to share that information with the employer, and they're not giving me a way to do so either through those HR systems. And so that's kind of what we looked at for Nick. For Francis, wants more information, more focus on skills. One of the things that, and this kind of comes back to resume parsing, one of the newer things that they are doing, and I kind of dove deep onto 3 of the major ones, is they're doing something called data enrichment, where they'll parse out your resume, they'll use AI or algorithms to extract what they find as skills. But then it'll take, and those are generally like kind of keyword finding things, but then it will normalize it against some other framework. The one I've seen most often used is Lightcast Open Skills framework. And so, just it solves some semantic problems, because it might say, hey, we found this word, but it's equivalent to this actual skill that's been recognized and is in the Lightcast, previously MZ, previously Burning Glass, in their database. And it's open, so there's actually a page where you can drill into that skill, get a better definition for it. Brianna wanted more integrations, more ability to verify skills. I think one thing we're maybe looking at is a little bit more integration within this space. I know EdTech has quite a bit of integrations between platforms and systems. Finding a little bit less in HR, but that's also kind of growing as these need to kind of work with each other. And let's see, yeah. And then Malik wanted better sort of post-hiring analysis. So better better reporting to inform that. What was I gonna say? So he wanted better post-hire data and analysis you can use to inform more strategically designed outreach to potential candidates, more effective evaluation processes, and really the data that's in some of these credentials can offer some of that information, but he would like it, kind of all in one system, sort of a one-stop shop. And talk maybe a little bit just more about one other thing we saw with filling out all the applications and the parsing is we want normalized data, which so that we're all kind of speaking the same language. And to do that, sometimes if you're filling out a form, there'll be a drop down, say just as, you know, if you're filling out your city and state, they might have that info in a drop down. It guarantees that that's going to be a valid data point as opposed to just typing anything in that could just be gibberish. That's good in one hand, but when it comes to academic credentials or professional credentials, especially non-degree credentials and skills and other sort of assessments, oftentimes that information is not available in a drop-down. They might have a select set of credentials that they sort of accept, but new and more, especially non-credit, are sort of being created all the time. So that's sort of another issue where they want good, clean data, but they have to also allow for the right data to be entered and, you know, transmitted through the different systems. So that, because right off the bat, it could be a mismatch. And just one quick example, when I was filling one out, it asked for my college degree and my major, and all they gave me was a series of drop-down menus. And the closest one I could find, and well, so I have a degree in music composition. Closest I could find was music and dance, and that is just not right. I really can't dance at all. So kind of off the bat, I'm already sort of giving them misinformation to no fault of mine and potentially no fault of theirs either. So that's kind of just what we looked at, is how does this flow through the systems? What data gets lost or mangled in the process that could prevent, you know, making that connection between a candidate and their employer and hiring manager. All right, I've probably talked enough. I will hand this off to Anne to talk a little bit more about the ecosystem. Yep.
Yeah, so this is sort of the first stop in this roadmap that we talked about for a potential solution. The first thing for us was to really understand the existing process, and Chris explained this a little bit. In this diagram, that upper path is the dominant current way that hiring gets done. It is still overwhelmingly still based on those PDF resumes, although job boards are certainly a major player as well. The learning that Chris also mentioned in this pathway, the existing pathway, was the existence of these resume parsers. So taking the resume or the profile and turning it into structured data by an intermediary parsing company. And then they feed that data, which is now digestible by the employer, by their HR platform. And that was a key integration. And I'll be sort of returning to that in the actual roadmap, but the big key learnings about those intermediary parsers was one, that they don't currently have great solutions for non-degree credentials. And this is something Chris did a lot of additional research on, and that's in the report, like kind of what happened to non-degree credential data, because there's not as clean of a pathway for them to parse it and standardize it. And the second learning was that these parsing companies are parsing resumes for skills already and assigning skills. So they're looking at what you put in your profile, in your resume, and extrapolating a list of structured skills that the employers can read and sending those on to the employers, to the HR people. And you'll see why that's important in a moment. The other pathway, of course, is the emerging one, which is the wallet, the digital LER pathway, where individuals have a wallet that contains their own learning and employment records, and they are handing those off to wherever they're applying for. This is very much emerging in Chris's many applications. There was, again, he mentioned like there just was no way for him to submit an LER currently, but it's something that we're going to be considering in the roadmap. Chris, if you want to go ahead and advance there. So this is the proposal, and I know it's a lot to look at. I think the first sort of thing I'll say is the general philosophy around this idea is that it is efficient to build upon existing pathways and utilize existing players. So that's kind of the first place we're coming from. And the big ask from our HR leaders was more data, better connection. So knowing that, the first step we were proposing is that seeing that these intermediary parsers are already assigning skills based off of information from resumes, that is something that could be expanded upon. So rather than just looking at, you know, a course title in your resume, you know, you say, I went to this school and I took this course. They are now, as it currently exists, assigning skills based off of the name of the course you took. It could be a much richer, more accurate experience if they instead were to utilize a curriculum data source, like a third-party warehouse of syllabi, for example, and Open Syllabus is just one example of this. So now the resume parsers are saying, okay, this is the course that you took. We ping this curriculum data source, and all of a sudden we have like the actual syllabus of that entire course, and we're getting fed back all of the skills that are associated with the verbiage in that syllabus. As a parsing company, they are putting those skills into the structured data list that is being sent over to the employer's HR platform in a way that they can digest it. So that's like the first step. That's an important step because once you have that sort of loop going, which is a pretty easy integration, it's not that big of a stretch to then also ping a credential data source. So now you're not just looking at college syllabi, you're looking at credential syllabi essentially, and being able to then extract all of the skills found in that data source, sending those skills back to the employer in a way they can digest. So that was the imagination around kind of how to get a foot in the door with what is already an existing integration. The idea for the roadmap was also to build upon these steps. So the next step, once that flow is going, is to add additional data beyond just skills. And some of the non-degree credentials in particular have wonderfully rich data about all about like how long it took to earn it. It could be, you know, the prevalence of that non-degree credential among other applicants or other people in that position. There's all sorts of richer data that employers were looking for that could flow along the same pathway. Finally, the third stage is more of an integration, so expanding the ecosystem. So the first stage was really, the idea was to connect a small number of players, just a few curriculum and credential data sources that happen to have large amounts of data, and start, you know, the information flow that way. But as these employers get this richer data, their expectations are going to change about what they want to know from candidates. And I think that change in expectations makes conditions more favorable for additional integrations. So it's a comfort level, but it's also, you just come to want to know more about these things. So that was sort of the next step, would be to connect LER wallets with the parsing companies, as well as eventually directly with the ATS and HR platforms. So overall, the idea is more data flow and more connection among ecosystem players. If we had to summarize the roadmap in one sentence. Again, I feel like this is a big pitch for the report. This is laid out much more explicitly with more detail. But that's kind of the high level view that we wanted to share. I definitely want to leave time for questions because this is a lot. So Chris, if you want to advance, I think Ellen is going to wrap things up for that.
There we go.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. So we are going to enter Q&A here. We just have this one slide. If you want to get a copy of this report, you can put your email in the chat. However, NCRN folks have been kind enough to also say that they'll add the report into the next newsletter, and there'll be a link, and you'll be able to receive the updates and probably maybe the copy of this presentation. So, but also we can have a direct link to you if you want to put your email in. And then there were a couple of questions in the chat about whether employers know what this all means. Chris, you provided an answer. Is there anything else you wanted to say to the group?
Yeah, so the question was, I guess there's different terms for similar or the same things. So we've heard LER, ILR was something for a while, interoperable learning record, I think. ACRO, who maybe some of you guys know, is the Association for University Registrars. They support what's called a comprehensive learner record, so a CLR. Yeah, so I mean, that was one question sort of to the different, sort of names of what we're talking about, but they're mostly the same or similar. There probably are some differences too, but and what else? I think there was a question on, do employers, essentially how familiar, and maybe I extract a little bit more from the question, but are they familiar with things like this LER or a wallet? And for the most part, no. It's still very emergent. But the good news was that a lot were familiar with micro credentials, or a couple other derivatives of that type of a term. And a lot of hiring managers still did see a lot of value there. But there's definitely more communication and I don't know, spreading the word sort of about some of this.
One of the things I'll say also about the familiarity of the people that we spoke with, there's interest, but I think that we saw skepticism around the information that these folks get from algorithmically driven tools. And so, if they want information that's going to help them prioritize what the skill sets are that they need. And so a lot of them talked about using a manual process, regardless of the fancy ATSs or things. They also had a step in there that required a lot of manual review. And so for us, that was a big takeaway.
Yeah, I think, did Phil have
I see
his hand
Philip
up?
has a hand up. Yeah.
Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, just a quick question. I see the analysis here kind of stopped at the ATS and didn't get to the point where many, as you were just implying, of the application processes, then after they have an applicant pool of some sort, do verification checking, calling the sources of the credential claims or other things to add this, as you pointed out, the sort of personal inquiry as to the veracity and or truthfulness or the ability to confide in what was presented. And one of the questions I have is was that something that was considered out of scope for this, or was there the possibility of mentioning to them that some of that checking has actually been done by the verification of the credential service, and might save you time and money?
Yeah, I think I know what you're asking there. And so our research did go further. We didn't really talk about that, in this one today, but it did go further. And what we found is it's unfortunately, or maybe it's fortunate, I don't know, but it's not a pain point, meaning there's already a solution that works and no one seems too troubled by it. And maybe they just can't picture it working any other way too. But normally, you get your pool of candidates, you get filtered down to, your short list. At any rate, you find someone who you're going to hire. At that point is usually when they do the background check, because they don't want to background check all of the applicants because it costs them money. So, they'll often, criminal background checks, educational, credential type background checks. And there's a ton of different companies out there that do that. Some have integrations with, some of the platforms, Workday and stuff like that. And so the employers themselves don't find that as a pain point or something, or a problem that needs to be fixed. And so that didn't really move the needle. However, one thought is if they come in the door as applicants and are pre-verified because we're able to run some sort of a little protocol in the background that looks at that cryptographic data that's involved with, say, a verifiable credential, they'll come in the door and we'll know that is what happened and that data has not been tampered with. And, it was issued by party A to party B. So it is sort of like a transaction frozen in time that's sort of immutable, in theory at least. And so, but if they come in already, then that could save them time and money, because then they don't have to verify at the end. And one other potential issue is, if you get that, you've found the right candidate, but then their background report comes back that they've just been lying about everything. Well, now they have to probably start the whole process over. And so, there's a cost to bad hires, right? There's also a cost to just the, trying to get someone hired to begin with. You get all the way to the end and now you got to start all over and, reopen that pool. I do think there is value there. And I think, there's other groups around. One is Velocity Network. That's a nonprofit that's looking into that. But yeah, so sorry about that. We didn't really include much about that, but there will be some of that in the actual paper.
Thanks. I just added a little more in the chat. Thanks very much.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, one thing we also always want to keep an eye on too is who's being left out of today's process and should probably be included into whatever the future process is. There's obviously those who don't have, say, a degree, but they could have other credentials. They've taken courses, other non-degree kind of things. So, the system should work for those people too. Were there any other questions? Not really been looking at the chat.
Yeah, it looks like some of the chat is among, so there's been some of the questions have sort of been answered.
Okay.
Matthew Linton had a question. I don't know if we fully
Yeah, no, okay,
addressed.
so
Yeah.
so I'll just take a simple use case. We'll just say an actual degree program. So if I'm a student at a university and they issue me a credential for that degree, it could also potentially, today's world, it's more or less going to be on my transcript, and that's usually what either the National Student Clearinghouse or or the actual employers that or the schools they'll call and they'll get your transcript, you know, to verify some of that information. And so what was I trying to say? So if I already have that information, and this also touches on the idea of whose information is that. I've earned a degree at this school. Can't I pass that information on to an employer in a way that doesn't require that employer to sort of get back into the loop? Or school for that matter. And so there would be a way, you know, if you have a wallet and these individual learners have their information that's really theirs, they've already earned that. Yes, there are probably laws about universities have to, you know, hold on to that information, probably more so with degree than non-degree, but at any rate, if you have one of these verifiable credentials, then it's built into the process that it comes with a protocol to verify it. And it gets a little technical, so I don't think I'll get into that, but it could, you know, one thing we also have to be careful about is, you know, recreating a system, potentially even more inequitable system, I guess, you know, where we're setting up different classes of those with credentials and those without. So some other things to think about there.
I think important in the LER discussion too is, you know, just the finding that there are no connections right now between those systems and the employer's HR systems. And so part of the roadmap was, you know, incrementally building up connections and pathways to get that process flowing.
Well, thanks, everyone. Does anyone else, I think we're 1:45. Is that it, Kyle?
Yeah, we're at 1:45, so there is time if anybody wants to ask anything else. If not, maybe I can attempt to do kind of a closing capstone question here, which is that we've talked about on the LERs. You know, there's a sense out there that the field, you know, we're waiting for the field to clear somehow, that there's many different competing LER platforms, and maybe at some point in the future we'll get to a point where there's fewer and there's more common use of a common standard. To what extent do you think that you know, in order for you to have, you know, the integration into applicant track, to what extent do you think the fractured nature, I guess, of the LER landscape is impacting the applicant tracking systems and making either maybe encouraging, but possibly also inhibiting integration across platforms?
I think that's, and this is something that we talk about more, you know, this is what we would call stage 3, which was like the more ecosystem connection stage in the report. But there was a reason why we started with very few additional players. You know, we're talking about like tapping 1 or 2 data sources, because you're exactly right. Like you can't expect the ATS to be able to interface with all of the different structures of data that the LERs might be presenting. So, but the idea is that this, like, it's opening the door, and that, again, like once more data starts flowing, there will be more appetite. And, you know, we even touch on some of the big players in the room, like the Apple and the Google wallets that are like looming on the horizon. But for us, that later stage did not require winnowing down the number of providers there. It's more of a mind shift in what employers were looking for. Ellen or Chris, any?
No, I just looks like Holly just sent one more other kind of interesting note, and we did look at AI as a part of this. I'm kind of surprised it took this long for an AI question to come up, but yeah, and we will get into some of that in the report. A lot of it has to do with identifying skills and kind of doing these extrapolations. I think it's helpful so far, but there's a lot of sort of black boxness going on where we're not really sure what the AI is doing to arrive at that, result. But that's certainly going to be a topic that will only get bigger from here on out. So.
All right, then perhaps we can all have about 10 minutes back in our day. But thanks so much for the presentation. We'll be back again next month with another NCRM webinar. We'll hopefully have some details to confirm and put out to the list in the coming days. So we'll see you all next time.
Yep. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.